All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. My name is Hilary, and I work for the webinar facilitators Aggregate Consulting. Tonight, we have the third installation of the three-part series by AgVic on stock containment areas, and part 3 is on nutrition management and risks in stock containment areas, presented by Nick Linden. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This control panel will be at the top right-hand corner of your screen. The red arrow on the left collapses and reinstates this control panel if you want to get a better look of your screen this evening. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. As Nick goes through the presentation this evening, please type your questions in the box provided. I will relay them to Nick at the end of the webinar, so please make them as succinct as possible for when we get to question time. I will also note now these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website, normally within a week of the webinar. To introduce our presenter this evening, Nick Linden of Agriculture Victoria. Nick is passionate about all things ag after a background working with beef producers in Gippsland. He shifted to northeast Victoria where he started working with sheep producers. He's been lucky enough to work with many components of the supply chain, from seed stock producers through to intensive finishing systems. He loves nothing more than getting out on the farm and eventually following the product, be it beef or lamb, through to processing. Along with his wife and 2 kids, Nick runs a small self-replacing meat sheep enterprise at Rutherglen. So I will just hand over to Nick to get started. See it pop up anytime, Nick.
I did, thanks Hilary. And hopefully you can see that.
Excellent, can do. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Hilary, and obviously thanks to everyone for making time to join in, and I hope everyone gets something out of it this evening. I'll really try and build on sort of the previous information that Chris, but particularly that Clem's put into his presentation last week. So I really want to sort of pick up on a couple of the topics that had come up towards the end of his presentation. And I guess as a generalization, the presentation, a bit like the earlier ones, it's probably slanted more at people that haven't got an extensive use of stock containment areas in the past and people that are looking into it. But hopefully there's a bit of something for everyone if there are some people online that have been using them for a fair while. So what I wanted to run through, and it basically, as I say, it's picking up a couple of the messages from last week, particularly things that we were talking about in terms of stock densities. There was some mention of pen enrichment and the use of shade, or the need for shade as well. So I've got a couple of slides from some of our work that will relate to that. And then I wanted to scroll through, it's in principle, it's the same as any old feed budget, where there's 2 components you need to think about. One is what the animal needs, so what they need, and on the other hand of that, just like any budget, financial, feed, whatever, is what you've got. And the what you've got particularly relates from an animal nutrition perspective to, what feed you've got on hand, what's the quality of that, and how much you need to give. And then it's no surprise, following on from that is, and I'll probably say it, I don't know how many times, but probably plenty, that there's a real need to cost the rations and cost the feed that you're putting into the animals whilst they're in containment. And then we'll have some key messages. I'm certainly not an animal health officer, but I have got some slides at the end, because particularly related to the risks associated with using a stock containment area, a lot of them do come down to animal health. So I've got some slides that have been put together by one of our animal health officers that are at the conclusion of my slides that we can scroll through as well. But that's basically what I want to cover off this evening. And the first slide that comes in next, I ummed and ahed if I should put this one in, because it always gets a run when we're talking about the use of stock containment areas, during a period of dry seasonal growth or drought. And it's but it always has a place in relation to when you're feeding animals as well. And it's all about setting targets for animals and making sure that you feed to achieve those targets, because, you know, and here's the relevance to a drought. We always say you really want to limit the damage to a drought to the period when it's not raining. And what I mean by that is that we don't want to compromise future performance by underfeeding animals now. So if we're going to put animals into a stock containment area, it's really important that we're aware of what their class is, the class of the animal, and that we feed them appropriately. And the message that follows on from that I like to give to producers is that a restriction early in an animal's life will never be recovered from. You know, there's all this talk about compensatory growth, and that'll kick in. Well, if an animal's been restricted pre-weaning, the likelihood of that happening is slim. And we've got some sheep work that lines up really nicely with the cattle work that came out of the beef CRC. And I'm not going to read through that slide, but you can have a look at that. You know, an early restriction in those animals to the point that they're restricted in utero. So while mum's pregnant, mum's done it tough, and then all those ewes or cows are all run as a contemporary group together in the one mob. You can see the difference in weight at marking for the sheep, and just as you can see it at birth in the cattle. And that early restriction to their growth stays with them all the way through to slaughter. Like just on the sheep one, you can see they're just under 3 kilos lighter at marking, and these were all run together as a contemporary group post lambing, and they were still 6 kilos lighter at weaning. When they went into finishing, they were 7 kilos lighter, and then by the end of finishing at slaughter, they were still 6 kilos lighter, so they'd never recovered. So looking after your young stock and making sure that you're not compromising future performance becomes really important. Just down the bottom, you can see there's a similar sort of comparison. You know, getting weight. You know, a lot of people are looking at joining in confinement, in containment, and you know, again, having the weight into your animals pre-joining is a really important consideration in setting them up for future success. I listened to a webinar only last week or the week before, and Andrew Thompson from Murdoch Uni was putting some figures out there. He was saying that in maiden ewe lambs being joined, 1 kilo of live weight equated to an extra 3% of lambs born. So an extra 5 kilos of live weight from Tomo's work was equating to 15% more lambs. So managing to the target becomes really important. Okay, so picking up on one of the topics from Clem's presentation was, do we need shade? Which, you know, otherwise known as heat stress, and what's the impact of heat stress? And there's potentially a massive impact across all stock classes. There was a lit review done in 2003 by St. Pierre, and he found a $2.4 billion cost to the US agriculture annually due to heat stress alone. Now, admittedly, that's across all ag industries, but a massive impact. And just to bring that back to a sheep-related, and unfortunately, lots of the sheep-related research that's been done related to heat stress is quite dated now. Like, I've got 3 references on that sheet, one's 64, one's 67, and the other one's 1969. But they're still worth referring to. And look, there's some limitations with them, but I think the message that comes out of it is still important. So the first one there, ewes exposed to 32 degrees C. Now, by any stretch of the imagination, that's not hot. And certainly there is a acclimatization that animals will get used to heat. So that's probably one of the limitations in this, because they looked at taking animals from colder conditions and then exposing them to that 32 degrees C. But for mine, it still sticks. So if we just go to that dot, the second dot point under ewes exposed to 32 degrees C, which is this one here, you can see they're exposed to 32 degrees C at 1 day, the 3rd day, the 5th day, or the 8th day after breeding. And you can see if they're exposed to 32 degrees C, or hot temperatures it was compared to what they had been in, only 20% of those ewes lambed if they were exposed to that hot conditions the day after breeding. And you can see that by 8 days after breeding, they've basically recovered. So the message about heat stress in ewes and joining is it can potentially knock out one cycle, but by the next cycle they've recovered and the impact's likely to be gone. And there's another reference there from Thwaites, 67, 100% embryo death in heat stress ewes. As I say earlier, the important thing about ewes is it potentially knocks them out early, but then they'll recover later. And it's an interesting story to keep in mind, because it contrasts to the situation of how rams are affected by heat stress. And I only put these in because I know there are people that are thinking about joining in containment. And the rams are very different. They've got really good conception 1 week after being exposed to a heat stress event. And I guess that's no surprise. It's because they've got a storage vessel on hand in the testes that holds the semen. So they're right to deliver that, and it will largely be unimpacted by the heat stress event. But when the rams are impacted is that 3 weeks after the heat stress event, which is exactly when roughly that the ewes have recovered by. So ewes are wiped out early, the rams are good early, the ewes recover for later, and the rams are no good for later. So there is this potential of heat stress that's impacting on ewes and rams, albeit it's happening to them differently. And what about dry stock? We did some work at Rutherglen where we looked at the impact of, well, the provision of shade versus no shade and what impact that had to. Now, this wasn't in confinement, as you can see by those pictures. The stock densities aren't anything that what we would expect from a stock containment area to have, but the other comparison is they're not in a feedlot either. So these animals weren't fed to try and be, going at 300 grams a day. They were fed. Well, basically it was a dry Phalaris pasture, and we were supplementing with pellets to try and get, that 140 grams a day. That's what they were looking to achieve. So the bottom line is, and it's no surprise here, they'll absolutely use the shade if they've got access to it, but it's a different question to say, okay, well, they'll use it, yeah, but do they need it? And that's a harder question to answer. Sheep are really good at changing their behaviour to mitigate the impacts of heat stress. So you can see down here, we've got sheep respiration rates. Where they did not have access to shade, their average respiration rates, when we've been out in the paddock counting them, middle of the day at sort of 12 noon, is 100 breaths per minute. And that contrasts to 65 breaths for the animals that had access to the shade. So they are really good. They'll change their behaviour. They spend more time standing. They'll have more time with their heads down if they don't have access to shade, and they'll increase their respiration rates. And it's effective. So you can see the sign just below that there is actually no difference in core body temperature, but for our work, where sheep had access to shade versus didn't have access to shade. No significant difference in core body temperature. So the increase the respiration rates works and does mitigate and helps them shed that extra heat load. But there's an energetic cost to having those higher respiration rates. So, the differences we found, the biometricians got excited about them, but they were small, but highly significant. So our animals actually did come out with significantly, but small, low levels. They were slightly higher in weight, and they were slightly fatter at the end of our feeding period for the animals that had access to the shade, and what that equated to in growth rate differences between these animals. And I say deliberately, these weren't in a feedlot. We weren't trying to make them go flat, hammer and tongs. So the growth rate differences between these was 145 where they had access to the shade versus 123 grams a day where they didn't have access to shade. So my sort of thoughts on shade, and look, part of that work, we also looked at some nutritional interventions, but we actually didn't get any responses to any of the blood works or the behaviour parameters or anything related to the nutritional interventions, but certainly there were in relation to the provision of shade. So, where do we come on shade? Not big differences in live weight in this scenario. Their body weight was no difference, but their respiration rates were higher if they didn't have access to shade. Obviously, their respiration rates are up. That's probably increased risk associated with pneumonia. I just reckon the provision of shade is relatively easy. It doesn't have to be fancy. Here are some lambs. This is actually in a feedlot rather than a stock containment area, but certainly hanging shade cloth off the fences, it might not give a lot of shade at 12 noon, but every hour after that, it certainly throws healthy amounts of shade into the pen. Very cheap, pretty easy to do. And certainly in this case, you can see we've put shade structures over the top of the water troughs, particularly where animals congregate. If they don't have access to shade, they'll certainly spend more time hanging around fence lines, and water troughs would be our experience from that previous work. So what about enrichment, which was another topic that came up quickly? And again, and I have to say, I guess this is my bias because it's a little bit where most of my experiences come from. This work where we looked at enrichment actually was done in a feedlot environment, and we looked at summer feeding period, and we had young lambs which were autumn drop versus lambs that were spring drop. And I often say when you're starting to feed lambs, anything that helps with the first couple of weeks is probably a benefit. But yeah, and certainly the provision of enrichment across both our age classes, it did have a significant difference. In the first 3 weeks, lambs that had access to enrichment, which in our case was that photo with the tractor tyres, of the tractor tyre with gravel in it, and then a truck tyre on top of that, and a car tyre on top of that, making these little pyramids. So in the first 3 weeks, our lambs that had enrichment were doing 253 grams a day versus 220 for the lambs without enrichment, and that was actually a significant difference. But start to end growth rate, it well, the difference had narrowed a little bit to the point that it wasn't significant. So there was a trend that those that had enrichment were still heavier, but it was only a trend from start to finish. And there was no difference in the interactions between young lambs or old lambs. I thought maybe the young lambs might have had more of a need for it, but that wasn't the case. And certainly I was probably a bit fanciful thinking that if they're getting a bit of a workout, maybe we'd see an impact on lean meat yield. And that wasn't the case either. We didn't sort of keep the condition off them or keep them any leaner or increase yield particularly. So again, it's something, if it's a bit like shade, that if it's there, they will absolutely use it. And you know, I guess there's benefit to that in terms of letting lambs or sheep exhibit natural behaviours. So yeah, the cost of what we had in the pens there was probably next to nothing. We just put some dirt and gravel inside those tyres, and I wish I could have played a little video because the lambs were absolutely all over it, and they certainly use it if it's in there. And certainly other things that we've used, although it was mentioned last week, and there might have been some limitations to hanging chains off fences in case stock get the hang of opening gates if they get a bit cunning, but certainly things like that. And even, you know, we've put soccer balls in pens, empty drench drums hanging off chains. Yeah, and they'll certainly use them all. So lots of opportunities for things like that, low cost, and they'll certainly use it. Hang on, I'm just trying to scroll through to the next slide, which seems to have locked. Excuse me, bear with me. Sorry, folks, I'll just have to scroll through. And the other point that we talked about was stock density. And some people have talked about, well, can we actually stock them any higher? So we've done, again, you know, it's probably not a perfect comparison because this was actually done with a feedlot scenario when we were trying to maximise lamb growth rates. But we'd had 322nd cross lambs, and half of them we'd stocked at 1 lamb to 5 square metres, which I guess is the, in inverted commas, the standard recommendation. And the other half of the lambs were stocked at 1 to every 3 square metres, which is certainly still giving them more space than what the minimum requirement is. But we thought that would be a worthy investigation just to see if we were getting any difference in animal performance. And it actually turned out that the averages between the high density versus the low density, or normal versus the high density, was barely changed. In fact, to look through the graphs, you wouldn't see any difference in terms of the average growth rates. But certainly we found there was a lot more variation between the lambs that were from those two stock densities, to the point, you know, there's a bit of a glib saying there, but the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. So from a feedlot perspective, we were certainly seeing an increase in the number of shy feeders, which to me was enough to say I'd be really reluctant to start pushing lambs down to 1 every 3 square metres. I feel a lot more comfortable having them at 1 every 5 square metres. And you can see the statement there that of the lambs that failed to meet, the lambs that failed to meet market specs, which was primarily for weight, so they haven't got up to the weight cutoff that we're looking for, 86.5 or 86.2% came from that high density treatment, contrasted by only 13.4 from the low density treatment. So that's largely this slide here. You can see this is our low density lambs that went straight into the feedlot, and was it 97% or so of those have made market specs, and then there's just a handful that didn't make it that we've pulled out the trial at the end. Whereas here's our high density treatment. So they're all on the same ration. They've all had exactly the same conditioning. These two treatments actually went straight into the feedlot. That was their induction. There was a second piece of work that we investigated with this one, which was lambs that were inducted to the ration in the paddock and then brought into the feedlot environment. But that's possibly a discussion for a different day, which did have, you know, the same trend stacked up, that we saw the high density lambs didn't perform as well as our low density lambs. but there were some other issues with those lambs actually coming onto the ration, whereas the ones that went straight into the feedlot certainly acclimatised and started consuming that ration more freely. Yeah, but slightly different. So animal requirements. So that's covering off hopefully on a few of the discussions, and hopefully that's worthwhile that we'd picked up out of Clem's discussion last week. But the things that I really need to get into, I guess, are the animal requirements, and that's what do they need? And the easy answer to that is that within a stock containment area, they need everything. You are responsible for the whole shebang, including keeping them a bit of company and all that sort of stuff. So the really big ticket items though are energy, and no surprise that's at the top of the list. Energy is probably the #1 consideration, and then we've got protein, fibre, and then there's a couple of different vitamins and minerals that we need to be aware of as well. It's really worth noting that the different stock classes obviously will have different requirements. So, you know, I'm sorry if this is a bit 101 for some people, but it's always a message that's worth recovering, recovering, like going over again. And I will say the AgVic drought books, as they're nominally known, are much more than just a drought book. They're a really good resource for feeding animals, and a lot of the material that I'm covering comes out of the drought books as well. They're really good resources, and they've got some really good go-to tables in them. I know mine live with a couple of little yellow sticky notes in them, so I can find the pages that I need most readily. And it also relates to some of the AgVic feeding livestock website. A lot of those tables are housed on that website, which we'll have a look at a couple of those tables shortly. So energy, the #1, the be all and end all. A feed analysis report gives you energy in terms of metabolizable energy. So that's the language that we actually talk about. It's megajoules of metabolizable energy per kilogram of dry matter. So that's the units that we're actually talking about when we're trying to compare the energy of one feed or another, or when we're looking at what the energy requirements of an animal might be. It's always in that megajoules of metabolizable energy. And it's really important that we know the energy value of the feed, because we need to be able to match that up to the requirements of the animal. It's you know, that's me just harping back to the feed budget, financial budget, doesn't matter. It's just what you've got versus what the animal needs, and that's what we need to be aware of. And obviously then the energy requirements, they vary depending on species, sheep or cattle, but then also the live weight of the animal, the expected performance, like are you putting weaners into a stock containment area that you're going to have some expectation of growth out of, or are you looking at mature dry sheep that are really only needing to maintain condition? And obviously then the other one that comes in is pregnancy and lactation as well. So that's the overview or the synopsis of the energy. Now, you just can't get away from putting up some tables that probably look horrendous in a PowerPoint presentation, but they're really important. Like these are the absolute, the Bible from a animal nutrition perspective, the feed requirements. And you can see here, it's all that stuff that we talked about varies how much energy animals need. So this, I could have dodged away from actually putting up the tables because I know they get a bit noisy, or they're a bit busy, but the reality is this is the sort of stuff we need to look at. If the animals are dry or if they're pregnant, how far advanced in pregnant are they, and what's the size of the animal that I'm talking about to determine what the energy requirements are. So it's really, I can't put up a feed budget for a stock containment area that applies to everyone's scenario. All I can put up is the process that we go to, but equally, there's advisors everywhere. There's lots of big livestock industry development officers scattered through the state, and we're really happy to help people to customise a framework for their own enterprises. So we certainly always put that offer out there that, whilst this presentation isn't going to give you a customised for your farm only type outcome, we're happy to step people through and work with them to try and develop that program for their own farms. So they're the sort of tables that we're looking at in terms of estimating or calculating what the energy requirements are for our sheep. And I don't want anyone to feel left out. So we've also got the energy requirement tables for cattle there as well. And you can see it's, as our weight range increases and as our expected growth rate increases, then our energy requirement, accordingly goes up as well. The thing that's probably not as well understood or promoted for sheep that is there for cattle is that there's this really nifty formula for cattle for estimating their maintenance requirements, which is just that 0.1 times their live weight and then +5 will give you a really good sense for what the maintenance requirement in terms of the megajoules of metabolizable energy is on a daily basis. So that's probably slightly something that's a little bit different from sheep, but certainly is a good reference to have for cattle. So the other one that we talked about, energy goes first and foremost. We wave the flag for that one most. Protein gets a lot of attention, and you could do a half-hour session on protein alone really easily because people get pretty excited about it. They tend to, rumen degradable protein versus bypass protein. It tends to, or even non-nitrogen protein tends to get a lot of attention. Suffice to say, look, it's required for almost all bodily functions, and when you get a feed test back, it's basically expressed as crude protein, and the crude protein percent, it just basically relates to the percentage of nitrogen in the feed. When they tend to test it away, they'll actually calculate how much of nitrogen is in that feed, and then it's just a mathematical calculation to give you the percentage of crude protein from that. Much like energy, it does vary according to all those things, just like before: age, animal growth rates, pregnancy status, lactation status comes into it as well. Protein ties up really neatly with immune function and immune capacity. So it's no surprise that the classes of animals that are probably most susceptible to say a challenge from parasites are the same ones that have a really high protein requirement. Because if an animal is a weaner, it's young, it's got lots of growth and development to do, it needs a high amount of protein for that. If it's partitioning protein to meeting those requirements, it can leave itself exposed to immune status and fighting off a worm challenge, just like your lactating animals can be vulnerable to parasites as well. So there's a bit of a tie-up in that regard. Your grains and pellets are going most likely to be medium to high in protein levels. Your hays, your straws, I'm going to say nearly definitely are going to be at the lower end. It's going to be a good hay if it's high in protein. And the obvious exception to that, let's wave a flag for, would be lucerne, but that is the exception. The other one that comes up and gets talked about a little bit, well, it comes up in different sources, but about the role for livestock and urea. They're quite a different mechanism. When you provide urea into a ration, the urea is basically, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a magic outcome that it all of a sudden lets an animal, get more. I'm using air quotes in. It doesn't let an animal get more out of a low quality feed. The urea that you're providing actually just feeds the bugs in the rumen, which actually lets the animal eat more of that low quality feed. So it's not that it gets, it's not that the animal can extract any more energy out of that low quality feed. The benefit to urea as a lick block is that it can just, because it turbocharges or it directly feeds the bugs in the rumen, that it actually increases the population of bugs, which means that they can just process more of the feed that's going into the rumen. So it actually lifts the feed intake that way. I'd be really hawky about putting them into a stock containment area or in an environment where there's not a really big surplus of low quality feed available at all times, like you would see, say, out in a stubble. Where you're feeding to maintenance and potentially feeding sheep at, say, I'll just pick a figure, but say you're feeding sheep to 60% of what their appetite would let them consume. I'm not seeing a big role for a lick block with urea in that scenario. They're more about increasing intake of low quality feeds, and you really need an abundance of that low quality feed in front of them. So it's one that gets a fair bit of attention. There's certainly a role in a feedlot, but maybe not so much in a stock containment area when you are feeding more for maintenance. So just like we put up the energy requirement table, here's the sort of thing that you'll see for protein. And you can just see the variable levels in protein from, obviously our young stock have a higher requirement for protein than our dry cows, and our lactating animals or our growing animals have a higher requirement for protein than those that are just maintaining or ticking along. So that's the sort of table you'll see. They're really good resources, and there's plenty of those out there that when it comes to actually establishing what the requirement is for your animals, there's lots of references that you can go back to. Look, again, it's a busy table. I apologise, but I just wanted to show you, the fed income. This is the actual table that you'll see. If you go into the AgVic drought books, this is the sheep table that comes off page 31. There's there's a cattle equivalent, which is on page 38 in the drought books. They're really good resources, and you can see the figures that I've shown you. You know, you can find, here's my class of stock. I've got 60 kilo ewes, and I can see they've got an energy requirement per day of 9 megajoules. Like that's the way that you can start informing your feed budget for what you need to be providing your animals. These tables are the resource that let you do that. Or, you know, conversely, here I've got some weaners. I've got 35 kilo weaners that, you know, the top figure is 6.5 because they're just maintaining, but if I want them growing, they're going to need a higher energy requirement, sorry for that one. So they're the sort of tables that you'll see. They're really good resources. They might look a bit frightening, but they're actually really worth making friends with, because they're a great tool. And of course, we can break it down into really simple sort of language. And, you know, I won't talk to this one too much. It's more that it's there in the video if people need it, or in the recording. But it's basically just to show, you know, if you're looking at a maintenance ration, you can pare it back in terms of what are the protein needs, what are the energy requirements on a weekly basis for sheep that you're looking to feed. And you can see it varies in those different classes. So, you know, all the information that's summarized there in that little table, you can pull all that out of those broader tables that we started with. So the other one that gets a little bit of attention, and it's a little bit more challenging to an extent, because it's really hard to say, well, what is the fibre in the diet? Unless you're feeding a total mixed ration, it's hard to know, well, how much are they consuming? Like, how much fibre are they consuming if you've got hay or straw in a feedlot, in a stock containment area pen, versus, you know, and you're feeding that in a feeder and then still feeding grain on the out of either feeders or on the ground. Like, it's hard to come across, well, what is the total dietary requirement? So look, just for completion, there's sort of two fibre figures that you'll hear about. Neutral detergent fibre, you'll see that in your feed test results, and that gives you the indication of basically the total fibre in the ingredient that you've sent for feed testing, be that a grain, a hay, you know, so it's total fibre. It's all the cellular fibre, the hemicellulose and everything in between. And it's a really good indication for just how bulky that feed is. And NDF's important because it relates to the amount of feed that the animals can actually consume. You know, obviously, if it's really high fibre, the animals can only eat so much of it, because it just takes so much for them to break down. Like, your feed to get out of the rumen needs to be broken down to about 2 millimeters in length. You know, if you've got something that's really highly fibrous, think of straw, long chop lengths on it as well. It's a long time to break down. You know, that could be 48 hours before it will actually pass through the rumen, just because it takes so much time for them to actually break it down. You know, physically to crunch it down to a small enough side to get it out of the rumen. So that's neutral detergent fibre. There is another one that you can come across, which is acid detergent fibre, and that's more of an indication of the amount of the fibre that the animals can actually digest, rather than the total fibre. But, you know, I'll show you the next slide to me, which is slightly more important. But the thing that is really critical about fibre is when you're getting animals up onto a grain-based diet, it's a really important component of the diet, because the animals have to be chewing their cud. Like, if they're chewing their cud, if they're masticating like that, they're producing saliva, and if they're producing saliva, that's a really important buffer to offset any acid that might be building in the rumen. So it's a really important way to, you know, offset the risks associated with acidosis. So fibre is a really important part of the diet. I do think it's harder to estimate what it is that they're actually getting, but it is something that you need to be aware of. And maybe one way that you can actually do that is really good tool is actually just to monitor the fecal samples of the animals that you've got on feed. Certainly, we don't want to see animals that are down this end and scouring badly, probably indicative of that at that level, there's sort of some subclinical acidosis going on. It could be worse than that, actually. But certainly those animals are probably starting to need some extra fibre into the diet. Certainly, you know, that's a bit of a dated picture. It looks a bit dry, but something up like this is probably more what you'd be looking for. And at the risk of being crass, I'll quote John Milton, who's a great nutritionist from over in WA, and he used to say, sheep shit should always look like sheep shit, and it shouldn't look like dog shit. So walking your pens to actually check what's coming through your animals is a good indication. if you've got an appropriate fibre level, because certainly the sheep poop should still be looking like sheep poo. So that's a little bit of the background, or it's more than the background, that's a fair bit of a story about what it is that we need to be providing to animals in terms of energy, protein, fibre. The other thing that's really important to know is it's know what you have, and there's so much variation in grains, and particularly variation in your roughage sources as well in terms of quality. So unashamedly, it's a bit of a wave of the flag for, you know, feed test services and actually doing some feed testing so that you do know exactly what you've got. Like these are results from the feed test lab, and you can see there the oats. If you're feeding out oats, the variability. Well, are they 5 megajoule oats or are they 11 megajoule oats? Because what you need to feed will vary greatly based on that. And you can see also there's similar variation in protein. The energy levels of the cereals and your lupins doesn't seem to vary as much, but certainly there's big variation in protein there. So, you know, if you're mixing a ration to try and meet the requirements of weaners, certainly you need to be aware of your protein levels so that you can balance up that ration appropriately. And we will talk about balancing rations as well. So the other component, vitamins that we talked about, or minerals, sorry, for this slide, of what you should be putting into the diet. And certainly we would look to add salt at 1% and limestone at 2%. And, you know, the limestone isn't about they're going to get soft bones if they need calcium for bones. It's particularly around balancing up the calcium phosphate ratios if they're on a high grain diet. Which comes to urinary calculi and water belly, which we'll talk about in the animal health slide. And salt, particularly important to get animals drinking, just to make sure that the more they're drinking, the more they're flushing their system, and particularly important for weather lambs. So yeah, just some considerations there as well. So that's what we need to be feeding, which is one part of the equation, but the next calculation is all around, well, how much do I actually need to feed? And there's certainly no rocket science here, and there's certainly lots of really good tools. And I just implore people to find the tool that works for you. You know, there's some really great apps. There's some online tools that are real back of the envelope sort of person, which is probably a bit the way that I lean. You know, this is all I guess I can show you is the process that I go through in terms of calculating animal requirements and then balancing up how much I need to be feeding and so forth. So this is pretty much the process that I go through. And again, no rocket science. It's a pretty simple process that based from those previous tables, if we know we've got a 50 kilo ewe and she requires 56 megajoules per week, you can see this is why we need to know what feed quality we've got. So if we know that we've got wheat that comes in at 12.5 megs, it's basically then just a simple calculation to work out, okay, well, 56 megajoules she needs in the week, it's 12.5 megs per kilo of dry matter. So that ewe needs 4.5 kilos of dry matter of wheat per week to meet her requirements. And then it's for you to how you actually get that to her over, you know, is that over 4 feeds or is it over 3 feeds in the week? But the other consideration that does come into it is because we've been talking in dry matter, and I'm wary of the dry matter because it can be a bit of a rabbit hole to go down, but we need to be able to convert that dry matter into an as-fed basis. So, you know, as I've talked about, like the feed test results give you the units of energy, megajoules of metabolizable energy per kilo of dry matter. And there's a really important reason for that, which we'll get to, but you need to convert that 4.5 kilos. So if we're saying that our wheat is 90% dry matter, we just basically need to divide out the 4.5 kilos of dry matter feed by the 0.9, 90% dry matter to calculate out that we actually need to be feeding 5 kilos of as-fed feed. So if you're weighing that into a feed hopper, or if you're going to, you know, weigh out a bucket and time how long it takes to fill that bucket so that you know how much weight's going into your feed wagon or unit, just so you can keep track of how much you're actually feeding. And, you know, obviously with dry matter, cereal grains at 90%, you know, the dry matter in the as-fed is pretty close, but that's not always the case. It's probably more often than not, it's going to be close to the mark for a stock containment area, but where it really falls away is silage. So just to give a bit of a look at it, these bar graphs represent the total amount as fed, and that little blue component at the top of the bar is basically the 10% in wheat that's water. because there's no nutrient in water. That doesn't hold any of the energy. Energy is only held in dry matter. So if we have a kilo of feed as fed, 1 kilo actually only gives you 900 grams of dry matter. And we know the kilo of dry matter had 12.5 megajoules, but our 1 kilo as fed is only actually giving the 11.25 joules of energy. So it's just something we do need to be aware of, and you do need to be able to convert from a dry matter basis to an as fed basis. As I say, where it really comes into play is feeds that have a lot more moisture in them, such as silage. Like silage that could be 50% dry matter, for your 1 kilo that you're feeding only has 500 grams of dry matter. So if that silage, and I'm a shocker for picking easy figures that are easy to do the maths on, is 10 megajoules at 50% means that 1 kilo as fed is only going to give 5 megajoules of metabolizable energy. So, I think that one probably showcases the example really well why we do need to be able to convert between the dry matters and the as fed, because it's an important calculation. The other thing that we need to be able to do in terms of feeding animals and making sure that we're meeting their requirements is balancing ingredients. So we might have, in this particular example, and there's a tool that's called a Pearson square, which I reckon it's a really neat little, again, back of the envelope calculator. This may not be for everyone. Some people will much prefer to use, some of the drought feeding apps that are out there, which are really good tools. But for those people that, again, like back of the envelope, my preference is to show you at least the techniques that I enjoy and I feel comfortable that I would use. And this one's called a Pearson square. So in this example, you can use it for energy, you can use it for protein, but it's basically about balancing ingredients to make sure that you meet the target requirements of the animals that you're feeding. So let's look at 280 kilo weaners. And again, I'm picking numbers to make the maths easy in this example, just so it works. So, if that's not exactly the requirement based out of the tables, please forgive me. This one's just, I've cheated and done it to make it easier for me. So it's a Pearson square, and what you do is you've got in this scenario, you've got 2 ingredients on hand, and I've just said that I've got some oats and I've got lupins. And my oats, I know from we feed tested them, are 10% crude protein, and I've got lupins that are 25% crude protein. And I've got a target crude protein for our little 280 kilo weaners, so not so little, that's all right, 280 kilo weaners. We've got a target crude protein of 15%. So what we need to do is do some calculations to work out, well, how many oats and how many lupins do I need in a mix to make sure that I'm meeting their requirements. So the first step to it is just work out the difference, and you work in diagonals in the first case, but you work out the difference between what the lupins have got in them versus what the requirements of the animals are. So the difference between 25 and 15 is 10. And then you work in the opposite diagonal for oats. So the difference between the 10 and the 15 is just 5. And so then you've got 5 down in that lower right-hand corner of where I initially had that square. So then we're looking at, if you add the 10 to the 5, it gives you a 15 parts total in that ration. And how you address that is that then, okay, we've got 10 parts that are oats, scrolling across to the left where that's our first ingredient, and 5 parts that are lupins, scrolling across to the bottom line in our square. So if we know that's 10 parts to 5 parts in a total of 15 parts, like just by reducing that to, sort of some bit of basic mathematics, I guess, to say if we equate that to 3 parts total by dividing them each by 5, or the common denominator. So the mix that I would need to be feeding those is 2 parts oats to 1 part lupins out of a 3-part total to make sure that they're getting a 15% crude protein diet. So that's one way that you can actually balance that diet to make sure that you're giving the animals what they require. And I really need to just emphasize, I think I said I'd say it about 30 times or whatever in the course of the presentation, is that cost it out. Like, please cost it out before you even run out the first wagon load of grain to sheep in containment. So the sort of calculations, back of the envelope stuff, 100 sheep on grain at $340 a tonne, 34 cents a kilo, 5 kilos as fed. And you can just see, I'm just scrolling through, that's my flow of logic for how I'd do it. But it's really about, I'm just imploring with you, please, like, don't get into the trap of just having another truck of grain coming, before you've done the sums and actually work out how much that it's going to be costing you up front. And look, similar calculations, different duration, but it's the same process for if you're feeding cows, for if you're feeding sheep. It doesn't really matter what you're feeding. It's the same example to actually cost it out, and please be aware. And there are some fantastic tools that take, you know, my little back of the envelope calculations and will do lots of those for you. One of the greatest ones I reckon is out of the AgVic feeding livestock website. So if you could see, if I had my webcam on now, you'd see that I'm waving a flag, and it's really for that feeding livestock website. It's a great resource. But this, again, it's probably not a great slide, but it's great information. So I hope that offset's not a great slide. You know, here, all you need to do, enter in your grain price, enter in your mob size, which are those two considerations that I've put in that first red circle, and then enter in how many kilos you're going to be feeding per week. So I've varied that between those 3 months, but you can calculate that for your job based on those energy tables that we looked at earlier in the presentation. So know the kilos that you're feeding, know your grain price, know your mob size, and all of a sudden this spreadsheet will give you your cumulative kilos of how much feed you're going through from start to finish. It'll give you your cost per head. It'll give you your cumulatively cost per head. So you're not just getting it for that month, you're getting it from start to finish, and it'll give you your total cost. So right up front, you know, for entering in 5 figures between starting price, your mob size, and how much you're feeding, it's given you a lot of really good information so that you've got that right up front, which I just reckon it's a great resource. It's really simple, and it's just there in the sheep tools and calculators part of the feeding livestock website. So yeah, you shouldn't promote things too heavily, but it's a cracker and it's really easy. And that's from someone that by far favours to work on the back of the envelope. So it's a really good tool. The other thing I need to wave a flag for is cost your feeds on an energy basis, because not all feeds are equal. Despite equal looks, sometimes there can be surprises. So, you know, it's really important whether or not you're just looking at grains or whether or not you're looking at hays and silage, take the time to actually cost them out on a per energy basis. Like here's 3 feeds, hay, silage and wheat, 340, 320 and 430 I've made the wheat, which is probably a bit over the odds for this season, but gives you an indication. And when you cost those through out to a cents per megajoule basis, you can see even despite being the higher price at $430 on a cost per unit of energy, the wheat's actually the cheaper one. And you can see there's quite a difference between those two, between hay and silage. And, you know, hay prices, hay in the last probably 12 months has been a little bit cheaper on a unit energy basis. So it is something that is worth checking on and just making sure that you're buying the most efficient feed, the best value feed, I should say. I will keep scooting along, sorry, because I don't want to run over time. I'm appreciative of everyone giving up their time midweek. And again, I can only show you how I do it, but calculating the cost unit per energy, you know, I just keep coming back to, I am always trying to work out the cents per megajoule. So there's some things you need to know. You need to know what the energy concentration, you need to know the dry matter, and you need to know the cost of that feed. But in terms of calculating cents per megajoule, first thing for me, cents per megajoule. I need to know how many cents did that ton cost me. So if I'm spending, again, it might look simple, but I'm just showing you how I do it. $340 a ton times 100 cents equals 34,000 cents. Now, you know, I know it's a big number, but for me, it's just sticking with the process. So 34,000 cents per megajoule. The other side of the equation is how many megajoules am I getting? So 1 ton fresh, if it's 85% dry matter, gives you 850 kilos. Of dry matter. Every kilo of dry matter has 8 megajoules of energy. So I'm actually purchasing, for every ton that I purchase, I'm purchasing 6,800 megajoules. So cents per megajoules, there's the calculation. 34,000 divided by the 6,800 gives me, it's 5 cents per meg. So really good calculation to make sure that you're comparing things on an equal footing. Introducing stock to feed, obviously a really important consideration. You know, if you get it wrong, the implications can be disastrous. So ideally, animals would be they'd be imprinted prior to weaning, and they'd be actually imprinted with the ingredients that you're going to be feeding to them. So if you're going to be giving them like a cereal lupins mix, ideally they'd be imprinted with that pre-weaning. The most important thing is just go slowly and make sure everyone's eating. And, you know, on day one of offering grain to animals, you're going to be underfeeding them based on what their energy requirements are. So palatable hay that at least helps them keep up some energy intake is still really important as well. So you can see there the recommendations for sheep are start at 50 grams per head and increase that by every second day until you get to the target intake. And for cattle, it's start at ½ kilo a day and you can increase by that every second day. But again, yeah, it's really be careful, and it's but that's page 45 and out of the sheep book and page 47 out of the cattle book. Clem did a really good job last week, so I don't really need to talk about the environment too much. The thing that I will say, if you're going to be feeding in pens on the ground, which, you know, can be a really successful strategy, I'd really favour having a spare pen out in front. So you're feeding into an empty pen that you can then move those sheep through into that pen. And then when they've gone into that pen that's got the grain on the ground, then you move into the next one and run the feed out. So you're not trying to feed out through a pen that's got sheep in it. You know, unless you've got one of those dogs that can run ahead of the vehicle to keep sheep away from you, feeding in a pen with animals is a bit of a recipe for a disaster. And the other consideration that I would add, just to build on the discussion from Clem's last week, is that, you know, multiple feed points, if you're going to be using feeders, multiple feed points can be a good way for eliminating shy feeders and giving access to all animals, just so that they're not sort of being bullied out for when the feed is on offer. But particularly relevant if you're going to be using feeders. But, you know, and that, well, I don't need to cover off on trough space because we really had a good discussion on that last week. So there's lots of resources out there. You know, the feeding livestock website's a cracker. The drought feeding books have so much more to offer, and, you know, the New South Wales app for drought feeding's really good as well. And if you Google that, I'm sure you can find it pretty easily. You can also Google stock containment area case studies. There are some good ones. There's some, you know, really good producer experiences told in those as stories that are great to catch up on. And certainly don't be afraid to call on us anytime. So my key messages in relation to the feeding session is really know your animal requirements and then know what feed you really have. So that's about, you know, doing some feed tests and being aware of what your energy and protein levels are, and then monitoring your animal conditions. But a really good thing about having animals in confinement or containment is that it makes monitoring animals relatively simple. So please just do all your sums, like cost feeds on a cents per megajoule basis. And I reckon it's really important. A good start can lead to a good finish, and that can really set you up for a much improved future. But I'd also say really look after yourself. It's a big undertaking to put animals in containment and think you're going to be providing everything they need for the next 3, 4, 4.5 months. So do look after yourself so that you can look after your stock. And Hilary, have I got time just to scroll through just a couple of health slides, or should I call it at that?
You may as well. Nick, yep, keep going.
I'm sorry. I am sorry, everyone. So I'll do it quickly. Acidosis, and it doesn't need a lot because I'm sure everyone's experienced with it, but just start feeding slowly and gradually increase the rate. Don't go too hard too early, and make sure everyone's eating. And if animals have died from acidosis, you'll certainly know it, because when you post-mortem them, they'll have a gut full of grain and the rumen papillae will just flake straight off. It's pretty easy to pick. Urinary calculi, that's that water belly that we talked about. Really important to have limestone available. Particularly affects wethers, just because their urinary system's a bit narrower than of ewes. So salt in the diet to make sure that they're drinking, flushing the system becomes really important. Vitamin A, D and E, it's probably not going to be a big issue this season. Vitamin A is more of an issue when animals haven't had access to green feed prior to going into a containment area. So that's probably not going to be a massive one at the moment. Make sure that you use your 6-in-1, 7-in-1s before animals going into containment, because you could just protect yourself from the issues of the clostridial diseases. Salmonella, coccidiosis, probably more of an issue when conditions get wet. So I'm not thinking that's going to be a big problem, and I haven't seen it as a big problem, particularly with animals in stock containment areas. Worms, pneumonia, pink eye, foot rot, all those sort of things, but just what good management's needed for. And Hilary, I think I'll leave it at that. you know, prevention's better than a cure, attention to detail, and just monitoring animals all the way through. But as I say, one of the real pluses to having animals in a stock containment area is that it does make monitoring so much easier. And I will leave it with an apology for going so long, but thank you very much for everyone's time.
No worries. Thank you, Nick. And we can definitely excuse you for going over time because that was a really informative webinar. You know, and certainly highlighted some of the great tools that are out there. And I think we're very lucky now that we can add this webinar to that cohort. So I think it'll be one that'll definitely be revisited a fair few times, certainly. Did you want to just put your key messages back up, Nick? Did you stop sharing your...
I can go back though.
Yeah, just put them on. Just while wait for Nick to do that. If you do have to head off early, you'll be presented with a survey as you exit the webinar. Please take 2 to 3 minutes to complete this survey. It just gives feedback to MLA, us at Aggregate, and the presenters like Nick to make sure the topics are relevant to you guys as producers. If you do have any questions, please send them through. There are a few to get started with if you're right to answer a few, Nick.
Yeah, I'll have a go at it, Hillary. I'll do my best.
Rightio, thank you. The first one from Wendy, is there a link with the increase of prolapses, both types, in both ewes and cows with higher amount of grain, special rations, that they have been fed over 2 to 3 years to maintain a fat score and condition? I hope that sort of made sense to me.
Yeah, and I think I'd only be guessing, Hillary. I'd be reluctant to answer. It's not a topic that I've got a great deal of experience with. So, you know, I could hazard a guess, but I wouldn't feel comfortable just putting a guess out there sort of into this forum. So I apologise, Wendy, but it's just not one that I've got a lot of experience with. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you for the question. The next one from Grant. Buffers are pushed hard and often sold at 5% of the finished mix at around $1,300 a tonne. Given energy and protein and rate consumed is appropriate, how much value do they add, and are they necessary, or generally is limestone and salt enough?
Well, good question. They definitely work. Like, make no mistake, they are really good at assisting in safely transitioning sheep onto a high grain diet. But all I can give you is my perspective. My perspective is that they probably have more of a role to play in a feedlot type ad lib environment, going flat out on grain. I think a really prudent induction period where you're talking, you know, bringing them up to the target level over a 14-day period, and then getting to your, you know, every second day or every third day feeding. I think in containment, where you're basically more towards a maintenance ration as opposed to a production ration, there's not the same requirement for them. But, you know, look, I say that with, you know, you could say to me, yeah, but Nick, if I'm only feeding my sheep every second day, then the chance of subclinical acidosis is going to be even higher, and maybe the need for them is greater. And look, I take that on board, and I can't argue with it. But for me, that they probably have more of a role in getting up to a full feedlot ration rather than a stock containment area. That would be my perspective, but that's my call on it.
Great, thank you. The next one is hay necessary, or can you feed grain for a certain amount of time without any roughage in a stock containment area?
Look, there'd be some grains that you could possibly get away with. Certainly, you know, the one of the beauties of oats is that it's a higher fibre grain. So with oats, you might be meeting their fibre requirements. There's other grains like wheat's at the other end of the spectrum that is just so low in fibre and so high in starch. It's so hot that you'd be looking to have some other fibre source in with a mix that's high in wheat. But there's fibre and there's fibre, and this is why it's hard to quantify, because there's this not intangible, but there's a thing called effective fibre as well. And I could design a pellet that would have the textbook amount of actually fibre in it, but if the fibre length in that pellet is so short that it's actually not doing much to encourage animals to chew their cud and masticate and produce saliva, it may still have fibre in it, but if it's not effective and it's not helping that process of rumination, like ruminants are built to handle fibre in the diet. So my preference is to always still have some fibre on offer to those animals. So yeah, and there's some cereals that, maybe, but there's some cereals that you'd be super hawky about, and particularly that's things like wheat that you'd just be, no, let's keep some fibre in the diet. That's what the ruminants are designed to do.
Great, thank you, Nick. Just another question. I'm sorry if you might have covered this actually at the start of the webinar. Is there a certain length of time as to which you can put sheep or livestock in stock containment areas, or can they be in there? So for a drought, is there a time length that is appropriate?
Yeah, I don't know actually, because I don't know the answer, but I am thinking, and I'm apology because I missed Chris's presentation. I'm thinking from a planning perspective, there probably is a time limitation related to seasonal conditions for use in a stock containment area. But from an animal perspective, I'd say no from an animal perspective, as long as you're meeting their variable requirements that will change from 1 month to the other. So from an animal perspective, I don't have a big issue, but from a planning perspective, there may be, and I have to say I'm not across that as I sit here today, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that question did come up as well with Chris.
Yeah, it would fit within his gamut.
Yeah,
Well,
he did deflect to effluent reasons, but didn't give a definitive answer. But I'm sure if you, Chris's details were on his part 1 webinar. So if you were to get into touch with him, I'm sure he'd be able to find the answer.
I guess the other comment that I would make though is that stock containment areas, or feedlotting for that matter, I could loosely define them, for sheep particularly, as not winter sports. But that said, there's with different design considerations and with different planning requirements, certainly you can minimise the issues that wet weather would give you. But certainly, yeah, as a throwaway line, I'd sort of it's a bit trickier through winter. So I loosely say, not a winter sport, but that's not a hard and fast rule, more of a throwaway line.
Thanks, Nick. If anyone's got any other questions, please send them through. Otherwise, there was certainly some great tools that Nick presented this evening that I would really recommend going and having a play with, even though that not many of you will probably be using stock containment areas at the moment. But it's certainly a good time while you've got all this grass on your hand to get your head around those tools and how they work and how they fit into your system. Because once you have a look
I have a favourite quote, Hillary.
Yeah.
Sorry, the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. So it is a great time to, just put a bit of the time and planning into it when it's not as pressing, so to speak.
Great. Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Nick. And it's great to see the Pearson Square make a comeback as well. Just one question that's come through.
I love them.
Again, yeah, me too. They were great. Any suggestions as to how producers or industry can improve the value and need for containment areas? The public image and visuals are not good.
Yeah, which to me, to a certain extent, is a shame, because the welfare outcomes can be absolutely brilliant. Feedback from people that use stock containment areas on a regular basis would be, it makes monitoring my sheep so much easier, it makes feeding my sheep so much easier, and it makes husbandry and looking after them so much better. So, from a welfare perspective, you know, I know you can, yeah, maybe there's an education that needs to go with it, because from a welfare perspective, a well-managed stock containment area can be a really good tool.
Certainly, and if we keep getting the weather that we have been in the past couple of years, they'll certainly become a more a fixture
No,
of.
and look, I think, yep, and I'm sure, you know, the other thing that I should mention as well, and I'm sure if Clem was answering questions, he'd probably bring up, is that, you know, a real underpinning reason using for stock, a really underpinning reason for the use of stock containment areas is to limit any damage on the farm to a small area. So rather than eroding or degrading, you know, 50% of paddocks because they're understocked in a period of low growth, you know, well, let's maintain some pasture cover on them so that paddock then becomes super responsive when we do get a break and we do get rain, rather than degrading them. Like, let's confine that impact to a small area of the farm so that the whole farm benefits. And that, you know, that's a massive plus to a stock containment area.
Excellent. All right, well, that seems to be all for this evening for questions. These webinars are recorded. Parts 1 through till 3 are available, will be available on the MLA website. We'd really like to thank AgVic, Chris, Clem and Nick for presenting these 3-part series for everyone. Certainly some great information to have on file now, and certainly this last webinar to wrap it all up. So thanks very much, Nick, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, Hillary. Apologies for going so long.
I'll let you off this time. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.